She was just a stewardess on his 50 million yuan yacht. One night she cooked, and everything changed. There is something I want you to understand before this story begins. On any given Saturday evening, somewhere off the coast of South Florida, a 170-foot superyacht named Cerulean cuts through the Atlantic at 14 knots. From the outside, from a distance, she looks like a floating palace made of white fiberglass and chrome. Her deck lights turn the water around her the color of crushed aquamarine. She moves with the unhurried confidence of something that has never been told no. Below decks, in a galley kitchen fitted with $200,000 worth of commercial-grade Viking appliances, a woman named Zara Josephine Baptiste is standing very still. Her hands are resting flat on the cold steel surface of the prep counter. She is 37 years old. She is wearing a white polo shirt with the yacht's crest embroidered on the left breast, the uniform of someone whose job is to carry champagne flutes and fold towels into the shape of swans. She is not supposed to be in this kitchen. She has been told, twice and very clearly, that this kitchen is not for her. She is in it anyway. In 45 minutes, 8 of the most powerful people in South Florida will sit down at the teak dining table in the main salon and expect to be fed a dinner that costs more per plate than Zara earns in a month. The man whose kitchen this is, a Parisian chef named Edouard, who charges $22,000 a month and speaks about his own cooking the way other men speak about their children, is lying on his bunk in the crew quarters, pale and shaking, his body staging a full revolt against the 4-foot swells that rolled in from the northeast 40 minutes ago. There is no backup, there is no plan. And the woman who is standing at this counter, whose hands are pressed flat against the steel to keep them steady, has never cooked a professional meal in her life. What she has is something else entirely. What she has is a memory so specific and so physical that it lives not in her mind but in the tendons of her wrists and the muscle at the base of her thumbs. It is the memory of her mother's kitchen in Chaguanas, Trinidad. On Sunday mornings when the air smelled like Scotch bonnet peppers and the sound of a spoon against a pot was the only clock the household needed. What she is about to do will change everything. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Zara had come to Miami the way most people come to cities that are not theirs, with a plan that was slightly too thin and a confidence that was slightly too necessary. She was 24 when she left Trinidad with a hospitality management certificate from the University of the West Indies, and a cousin's phone number scrawled on a piece of paper. Her cousin Denise lived in Opalaka and worked reception at an airport hotel and had promised Zara a couch and connections. The couch materialized. The connections took longer. For 3 years, she worked hotel banquets, serving rubber chicken at conference room dinners for pharmaceutical reps and insurance adjusters. She learned the grammar of service work the way you learn any language, from the inside, through repetition, through watching what happens when you get the inflection wrong. She learned to read a room before she entered it. She learned to make herself useful without making herself visible. She learned that the people who moved smoothest through spaces they were not designed for were the ones who understood exactly what those spaces wanted and gave it to them without complaint. She got the job on Cerulean through a maritime staffing agency in Fort Lauderdale. The agency was called Horizon Crew Solutions. They placed her as a junior stewardess on a 30-day charter season and told her the position came with a non-disclosure agreement, a uniform allowance, and a daily tip pool that, in good months, brought her total compensation close to $6,500. She signed everything the same afternoon. The yacht belonged to Dalton Mercer. He was 51 years old and had made his first $100 million in offshore oil drilling equipment before most of his college classmates had paid off their student loans. He now ran Mercer Energy Holdings from a glass tower in Brickell and kept the yacht the way other men kept expensive watches, as an extension of a self-image that required constant and costly maintenance. Dalton was not a cruel man. He was something more common and in some ways harder to navigate. He was a man who had spent so long surrounded by people who anticipated his preferences that he had lost the ability to register the presence of those who did not already know them. The stewardesses, the deck crew, the captain, they existed to him the way appliances exist. Not with contempt, simply without notice. His wife, Vivienne Mercer, was different. She had been born Vivian Allen, the second daughter of a schoolteacher and a man who repaired fishing boats in Bridgetown, Barbados. She had left the island at 12 when her father took a job in Fort Lauderdale and brought the family with him. She had carried the island with her the way some people carry photographs, not displayed but not discarded either. Just there, folded somewhere inside, pulled out in private moments when no one was watching. She had met Dalton at a fundraiser for the Miami Art Museum. She was working in commercial real estate. He was the kind of man who filled a room before he entered it, whose confidence was so total it read as gravity. They had been married 16 years. She wore her position well, the board memberships and the charity galas and the Brickell penthouse and the seat on this yacht. She wore all of it well, but there were evenings when the boat was moving and the horizon was the only thing she could see, that she pressed her hand flat against the railing and felt something she did not have a word for. Not loneliness, exactly. Something older than that. Something that tasted like mangoes that had been left in the sun too long. The VIP guest list for the October sailing weekend had been confirmed 3 weeks in advance. 2 hedge fund partners from Palmetto Bay, both of them Dalton's golf contacts, a state senator from the Naples district who was running for federal office and whose campaign Dalton had been funding in increments designed to stay below reporting thresholds, the senator's wife, a real estate developer from Key Biscayne who wanted to talk about a joint venture in the Cayman Islands, and Vivian. 8 seats, 1 chef. The chef was Edouard Girard, who had cooked in 2 Michelin-starred kitchens in Lyon before moving to the United States for reasons he described as personal and declined to elaborate on. He had been working on private yachts for 9 years and had mastered the particular psychology of the profession, the ability to produce technically immaculate food in cramped conditions while maintaining the social invisibility that ultra-high net worth clients expected from their service staff. He was by any professional measure exceptional at his job. He was also, it turned out, a man whose inner ear had never fully adapted to open water conditions, a fact he had concealed from every employer for 9 years through careful choice of routes, motion sickness patches, and a private pharmacological protocol involving ginger capsules and an off-label antihistamine. The Northeast Atlantic swells that rolled in on that October Friday evening were not something his protocol had prepared him for. Zara found him at 5:47 p.m. She had gone to the galley to retrieve a plate of canapés for the guests who were gathering on the sun deck, prosciutto on thin crackers, cherry tomatoes with a smear of something involving truffle oil that Edouard had prepared before the weather changed. The galley was empty. The mise-en-place for the evening's dinner service was laid out on the counter, half-assembled, each component labeled in Edouard's precise handwriting. She could smell something on low heat, a cream reduction for what would have been a lobster bisque. She found Edouard in the crew corridor, braced against the wall, the color of old newspaper. She did not ask him how he was. The answer was visible, brought him 2 bottles of water and a packet of saltines from the pantry, and was back in the crew corridor with the door closed crew corridor closed behind her in 4 minutes. Then she stood in the narrow passage between the engine room and the laundry and thought. What she was thinking about was not primarily the dinner. She was thinking about Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was the chief steward aboard Cerulean, Zara's direct supervisor and the person responsible for all interior crew operations. He was from Charleston, South Carolina, 34 years old, and he ran the interior of the yacht with the kind of preemptive precision that comes from having been embarrassed once in front of a very important client and deciding it would never happen again. Marcus's professional philosophy could be summarized in one sentence, which he had, in fact, said to Zara directly during her orientation. There is a lane for every position on this boat, and the only thing that goes wrong is when someone decides to step out of their lane. Zara's lane was fresh flower arrangements, cabin turn-down service, cocktail preparation, and silver polishing. Her lane did not include the galley. She walked to the main salon. Through the window, she could see Dalton, on the sun deck, holding a glass of bourbon, his back to the ocean, talking to one of the hedge fund managers, a compact man named Clifford Oakes, who laughed too frequently and touched people's arms when he made a point. The senator stood slightly apart from the group, watching the water with the studied serenity of a man who had been told that looking thoughtful was almost as useful as actually being thoughtful. Vivienne was sitting at the bow on a cushioned bench, alone, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, not watching anything in particular. Zara found Marcus in the service pantry, cross-checking the wine inventory against Edouard's service notes. She told him about Edouard in 22 words. She counted them later. Marcus looked at her for a moment. His jaw moved in a way that was not quite chewing and not quite speaking. His eyes went to the window that looked onto the deck, then back to Zara. "I'll call the agency," he said. "See if they can helicopter a replacement from Fort Lauderdale." "We're 40 miles offshore," Zara said. "In this weather, that's a 2-hour turnaround minimum. Dinner is in 45 minutes. Marcus's jaw moved again. He looked at his phone. He looked at the service notes. He looked at the window. "I can cook," Zara said. Marcus put his phone down. He looked at her with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward. Not dismissal. Exactly. Something more precise than dismissal. The expression of a man realigning the category in which he had placed a person and finding the realignment uncomfortable. "You're a stewardess," he said. His voice was not unkind. "You've never cooked a professional service in your life. I know. These people have eaten in places with 3 Michelin stars. I know that too." Marcus picked his phone up, put it down, looked at the notes again. The boat moved. Through the hull, they could both feel the slow roll of the swells. "If this goes wrong," Marcus said, "it lands on the boat, on the captain, on me." He paused. "Not on Edouard." Zara looked at him. She understood what he was saying. She understood it completely. She was being told that the risk would not be distributed, that if she failed, she would fail alone. "I understand," she said. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. When they are standing at the edge of a decision, and all of the and all of the options are bad. Finally, he looked away toward the deck and said nothing, which was, she understood, as close to permission as she was going to get. He was in the galley in under a minute. There are things that research cannot fully explain about food memory. The neuroscience of it is well documented. The olfactory bulb, which processes smell, connects directly to the amygdala and the hippocampus, the brain's centers for emotional memory and long-term storage. This is why a smell can return you to a specific Tuesday afternoon from 30 years ago with a completeness that visual memory cannot replicate. But the research stops short of explaining what happens in the hands. The way a particular motion, the rotation of a wrist while stirring, the specific pressure applied to the back of a knife, can live in the body separately from the mind that learned it. Zara had been in her mother's kitchen so many times, starting from an age before she had language for it, that the cooking lived in her hands the way swimming lives in a body that learned young. She had not thought of herself as someone who knew how to cook. She had simply absorbed it the way children absorb the accent of the place they grow up in, not by studying it, but by being inside it continuously until it becomes part of the way they move through the world. She looked at what was in the galley. She looked at it not the way a professional would look at it, cataloging technique and timing, but the way her mother had always looked at a kitchen, which was to ask what was already there and what it was trying to become. There was goat. There was, and this she had not expected, a full spice rack that Edouard maintained with the obsessiveness of someone who believed that the quality of a dish was 90% determined before anything touched heat. She found Scotch bonnet peppers, allspice, fresh thyme, garlic, a bottle of dark rum that was there for a sauce Edouard had planned for the dessert course. She found plantains, not ripe enough ideally, but she could work with that. She found coconut milk in the dry goods pantry and a bag of jasmine rice. She turned on 2 burners and started. The goat went into the largest pot with garlic, allspice berries, half a Scotch bonnet slit lengthwise, fresh thyme, a splash of rum, coconut milk, and enough water to cover. She put the lid on and turned the heat to medium. The curry powder she mixed herself from the individual spices the way she had watched her mother do it. Turmeric, coriander, cumin, fenugreek, small amount of ground clove, because the pre-mixed kind always tasted like a decision someone else had made. She did not have time for a traditional low and slow curry. She had 40 minutes. So she made decisions that were not traditional but that she trusted, increasing the heat, reducing the liquid more aggressively, building flavor faster than the recipe wanted. This was the kind of cooking that cannot be written down because it requires you to pay attention, continuously, to what the pot is telling you. While the curry reduced, she worked on the plantains. She sliced them thick on a diagonal, the way her mother did, and fried them in a cast-iron skillet in coconut oil until the outside was deep gold and the inside had gone soft and sweet. She transferred them to a rack, pressed each one flat with the bottom of a glass, then returned them to the oil for the second fry that makes the difference between good two-stones and perfect ones. The jasmine rice she cooked in coconut milk with a pinch of salt and a single kaffir lime leaf she found in Eduard's refrigerator, wrapped in plastic with the careful labeling of someone who treated his ingredients like archival documents. For a third dish, she made a cucumber salad, shaved thin on the mandoline, dressed in lime juice and a small amount of the rum, with fresh mint and a scattering of toasted coconut flakes. It was simple. It was cold. It would cut through the richness of everything else. At 7:14 p.m., Zara stood at the galley pass and looked at what she had made. She had cooked nothing she could put a French name on. She had cooked nothing that would appear on a menu at any restaurant in Miami. She had cooked the food that meant Sunday in her body. The smell of her mother's kitchen on mornings when the neighborhood was still quiet, and the only sound was the radio in the corner playing something old and brass-heavy and beautiful. She plated the curry in low, wide bowls, spooning the rich, dark sauce carefully around the meat. She arranged 3 two-stones on each plate in a small arc. She placed a portion of the coconut rice alongside and added a small mound of the cucumber salad where the colors would contrast. The plates were not architectural. They were not decorated with tweezers. They were honest. She pressed the service bell. Marcus appeared at the pass and looked at the plates. He looked at them for a long time. Then he picked up the first 2 and carried them to the dining salon without saying a word. Vivienne Mercer lifted the first spoonful of curry to her lips and held it there for a moment, just breathing in the steam. She put it in her mouth. She set her spoon down. Around her, the other 7 people at the table continued their various conversations. Clifford Oakes was making a point about carried interest. The senator was laughing at something. Dalton was watching the ocean through the window at the bow, doing the thing he did when he was in a room but thinking about a meeting. Vivienne set her spoon down and sat with the flavor on her tongue and in her sinuses and somewhere behind her sternum where things that are not quite feelings and not quite memories live in the body of a person who left an island at 12 years old and has been, in some very specific and very private way, trying to find the route back ever since. It was the Scotch bonnet. It was the allspice. It was something in the ratio of coconut milk to liquid that she had never consciously identified as a ratio, but that her body knew the way it knew the Barbadian word for goat, which was different from the English word in a way that English speakers couldn't hear. She pressed her hand flat against the table. She pressed her hand flat against... She did not make a sound. She ate the entire dish slowly, more slowly than she had eaten anything in years. She ate the tostones. She ate the rice. She ate the cucumber salad. When she finished, she sat for a moment and looked at the empty bowl, and then looked up and found Marcus standing at the service door. "Who cooked tonight?" she said. It was not quite a question. Marcus looked at her. Something moved across his face. A calculation, a decision. "Eduard was unwell," he said. "We had an alternative cook available. I want to meet them." Marcus paused. "Mrs. Mercer, our staff. I want to meet the person who cooked this food." Her voice was the same volume it had been before. It was not louder, but something in it had changed, the way the air changes before weather arrives. Marcus excused himself. Zara was in the galley, beginning the cleanup she had learned to start before the service was finished, so nothing was left undone when Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Mercer is asking to meet you," he said. Zara's hands went still. She set down the cloth she was holding. She was still wearing her stewardess uniform. There was a small splatter of curry sauce near the hem of her polo. She looked down at it and then looked up. "Okay," she said. The dining salon was quieter than it had been. The 2 hedge fund managers had moved to the aft deck with their glasses. The senator and his wife were looking at something on a phone. Dalton Mercer was at the bow window, his back to the room. Vivian was still at the table. She looked at Zara the way someone looks at a person when they are not performing attention but actually paying it, when they are genuinely trying to understand what they are seeing. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" Vivian said. Not a question. A recognition, looking for its source. Zara stood at the edge of the table with her hands at her sides. "My mother, Chaguanas, Trinidad." She paused. "She cooked that way every Sunday." Vivian was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a different texture, like cloth that has been washed many times and lost its stiffness. "My grandmother made something almost identical," she said. "Bridgetown, Barbados." She looked at the empty bowl. "I haven't tasted anything like that in 31 years. The room was quiet except for the sound of the ocean against the hull. Dalton turned from the window. He had, at some point, stopped watching the ocean and started listening to the room. He looked at his wife's face. He looked at it the way men look at their wives' faces when they see something they've not seen in a long time and cannot immediately name. Then he looked at Zara. "You cooked all of this?" he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at the bowl. He looked at the window. He said, "I want to talk to you before we dock. There is something important to understand about what happened next, and it requires a small detour into the mechanics of the superyacht industry. In the private yachting world, the hierarchy of crew is rigid and professionally codified. The STCW, Standards of Training, Certification, and Watchkeeping, is the international maritime framework that governs crew qualifications. Below the captain, the chief officer, and the engineers sits the interior crew, divided into chief steward, senior stewardess, junior stewardess, and so on. A stewardess who enters a professional galley kitchen without the chief steward's authorization is not only violating internal protocol, she is, depending on the circumstances, potentially creating a liability issue for the vessel's insurance underwriter. Marcus Webb knew this. He had known it when he looked away and said nothing. What he had not calculated was what Vivian Mercer's face would look like after she ate the food. He had not calculated the possibility that Dalton Mercer, a man who had built a $400 million energy company by being able to identify what was valuable before the rest of the room caught up, would turn from the window and see it. When Dalton called Marcus into the aft deck the following morning, Zara was not present. She was in cabin 4, doing the turn-down service that was her listed responsibility. She was folding the corner of the sheet back at the precise angle Marcus had taught her on her first day aboard, and she was thinking about the conversation she'd had with Dalton the previous evening on the bow deck, under a sky so full of stars, it looked like something painted. He had asked her 3 questions. Not many. He was a man who had learned to distill his curiosity into the questions that would tell him the most. The first was how long she had been in hospitality. The second was whether she had ever considered doing something more with the cooking. The third was what she wanted. No one had asked her that in a very long time. What she wanted. Not what she was available for, not what her qualifications were, not what her shift preference was, what she actually wanted. She had stood on the bow of a $50 million superyacht with the Atlantic moving beneath her and the lights of other vessels visible in the distance, and she had told a billionaire the truth, which was that she wanted to own something. She didn't know yet what, but she wanted to build a thing that was hers, that had her name on it in a way she had chosen and not been assigned. Dalton had nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not agreeing or disagreeing, but simply acknowledging that they have heard something true. What Zara did not know, standing in cabin 4 folding a linen corner, was that Marcus Webb had been called to the aft deck and was at this moment explaining to Dalton Mercer what had actually happened the night before. That Edouard was incapacitated, that there was no backup plan, that he had allowed a junior stewardess to enter the professional galley without proper authorization. What she also did not know was that Marcus, in the process of explaining himself, had taken an action that revealed a great deal about his character. He had told Dalton that the decision had been his, that he had instructed Zara to cook, that the initiative had come from him. He was, in other words, attempting to take credit for the outcome while positioning himself as the decision-maker, which in yacht service culture would make him look adaptable and resourceful while leaving Zara's role ambiguous. Dalton listened to all of it. Then Dalton called Vivian to the aft deck. He told her what Marcus had said. He asked her if she believed it. Vivian looked at Marcus for a long moment. She had been in rooms with men who were repositioning themselves since she was 23. She had watched it happen so many times that she could see the architecture of it the way an engineer can see the structure behind a finished wall. She said quietly, "Marcus, when Zara brought the food through, where were you?" Marcus said he had been coordinating the service from the pantry. Vivian said, "She came to you and said she could cook, and you looked away." It was not a question. It was a statement of what had actually happened, delivered with a precision that left no space for a different version. Marcus did not speak. "That is not the same thing," Vivian said, "as making a decision." The conversation Dalton had with Marcus after Vivian left lasted 11 minutes. At the end of it, Marcus was informed that his contract would not be renewed at the end of the charter season, which concluded in 6 weeks. He was given his full remaining compensation. He was told this was not a termination for cause but a business decision, which was true in the narrow sense that Dalton made business decisions based on what he saw in people. And what he had seen in Marcus that morning was not something he wanted running the interior of his yacht. Edouard recovered by the following afternoon and resumed his duties for the remainder of the trip. He was not blamed for his illness. He was, however, informed that for future crossings in variable weather conditions, the vessel would be carrying a backup culinary staff member. Backup culinary staff member, when the next charter season began, was Zara Baptiste. She held both her stewardess certification and a new secondary title that Dalton's operations manager had created specifically for the role, crew culinary liaison. The title came with a pay increase, a written agreement that she would have access to the galley for a designated preparation period each voyage, and a budget for ingredients she could source independently. It was not a chef's position. It was something that did not quite have a name yet, which suited Zara. What it was, more precisely, was a beginning. Over the following 18 months, on the evenings when Edouard was not cooking and the guests were the Mercer family and their closer circle, Zara cooked. She cooked the way she had learned, from memory, from instinct, from a refusal to treat simplicity as inadequacy. She cooked Caribbean food and she cooked the food of other places she had learned to love during her years in Miami. She cooked food that tasted like specific people on specific mornings, and she cooked without apology. Vivian began requesting her by name for the private family voyages. The two women would sometimes sit on the bow after the other passengers had gone to bed, and Vivian would talk about Bridgetown, the particular quality of light in the early morning, the smell of the market near the wharf, and Zara would talk about Chaguanas, and they would find, in the space between one island and another, a particular recognition that exists between people who have both left a place and been shaped indelibly by having been there. It was Vivian who first suggested that Zara write the recipes down, not for commercial purposes at first, just to preserve them. Zara had laughed and said she didn't really cook from recipes, that the measurements were inside her, and she'd have to reverse engineer them by cooking the dishes and noting what her hands did. Vivian said that sounded like a book. Zara looked at her. Vivian said, "I know someone in New York, a literary agent who specializes in food writing. She has been looking for something that isn't the same 10 books about the French technique repackaged. She would want to talk to you." The book, when it was eventually published by a New York house 18 months after that conversation, was called Sunday in Chaguanas, Caribbean Cooking from Memory. The cover photograph, taken by a food photographer in a kitchen in Coconut Grove that Zara had borrowed for 2 days, showed a pot of curry goat, steam rising, shot from above in the early morning light. The title was in a typeface that was clean and unhurried. The author's name beneath it was Zara J. Baptiste. The book's dedication read, "For my mother, who taught me that cooking for someone is a form of saying, 'I see you,' and for the woman on the boat who already knew that." Vivian, when she read the dedication, closed the book. She held it for a moment. Then she opened it again and started from the beginning. Marcus Webb left the yachting industry after his contract ended. He tried for a time to find a chief steward position on another vessel, but the yachting world is small, and word moves through it the way water moves through sand, quietly, inevitably, everywhere. He took a position managing the front of house at a hotel in Sarasota, which paid less than he had been earning and carried none of the prestige he had spent a decade building. He was good at the job in the technical sense. He remained good at the technical dimensions of his work throughout his career. What he was not, and what he perhaps began to understand in the years that followed, was good at seeing the things that were worth seeing. The woman at the sink whose hands knew something he hadn't bothered to ask about, the value that lived in places he had not thought to look. He had spent his professional life managing the lane lines and enforcing the categories, and in doing so had missed the thing that the categories existed to organize in the first place. He sent an email to Zara 3 years after the night on Cerulean. It was brief, and it was real. He said he had read about the book. He said he had thought about that night more than he expected to. He said he was sorry for how he had handled things with Dalton. He did not make excuses. He said he wanted her to know. Zara read the email twice. She sat with it for a day. Then she wrote back 3 sentences. She said she appreciated him writing. She said she hoped his work was going well. She said she had already let it go, which was true, and also, which was the kind of truth that is made through the deliberate, repeated act of choosing to let something be true until it becomes so. The Sunday after her book came out, Zara called her mother in Chaguanas. It was a Sunday, so her mother was cooking. Zara could hear the sound of the spoon against the pot in the background. A sound so specific that it made something shift in her chest before her mother had said anything. Her mother had heard about the book from Zara's cousin Denise, who had read about it online. She said, "You wrote down the recipes?" "I had to reconstruct them," Zara said. "I had to cook them and watch my own hands." Her mother laughed. It was a particular laugh, the laugh of a woman who finds things funny when they confirm something she has long believed. "I could have told you what was in them," she said. "I know," Zara said, "but I needed to find them myself." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Through the phone, Zara heard the sound of the pot, the particular low percussion of Sunday in Chaguanas. "You always did," her mother said. "The connection was not perfect. It never was between Miami and Trinidad. There was always a small delay, a slight thinning of the voice across the distance." But Zara pressed the phone against her ear and listened to the sound of the spoon, and the ocean outside her kitchen window in Coconut Grove moved in its slow, indifferent rhythm, and she understood what her grandmother must have known, what her mother had always known, what Vivienne had spent 31 years carrying without a name for it, that you can leave a place completely and still be made entirely of it. That the hands remember what the mind forgets. That when you cook for someone from the place inside you where the real thing lives, they feel it. They feel exactly that. The realness of it. And no amount of technique or expense or prestige can replicate what it feels like to be fed by someone who is cooking from that place. She had carried it across 400 miles of water and into a kitchen she was not supposed to be in, and she had put it on a plate and sent it out. And a woman who had left an island at 12 years old had set her spoon down and pressed her hand flat against the table and felt for the first time in 31 years, found. That is what food can do when it is real. And that is the only thing worth knowing about any of this. I want to talk to you directly now because this story is not really about a yacht or a billionaire or a woman who gets discovered. Those are the containers. The story is about what lives inside a person that nobody put there. The thing your mother's kitchen gave you before you knew you were receiving it. The competence that lives in your hands from years of watching and being present without knowing you were learning. There is research from the University of Toronto on what psychologists call tacit knowledge. The things we know that we cannot fully articulate. The expertise that lives in the body and not in the language. What the research shows is that tacit knowledge is often the most valuable kind of knowledge, precisely because it cannot be transferred by teaching alone. It has to be lived. It has to be absorbed. It cannot be purchased or manufactured or faked. Zara Baptiste did not take a culinary course. She did not apply for a chef position. She stood in a galley she was not supposed to be in and trusted the thing her body had been carrying for 37 years. That is not luck. That is not magic. That is what happens when a person stops waiting for permission to use what they already have. What is the thing that lives in your hands that you haven't used yet? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story reached something inside you, please subscribe. The next story I tell will be about someone else who was carrying something no one else could see, and I want you to be here for it.